58-year-old Robert Barron was both a lifelong resident and prominent business owner in his hometown of Old Forge, Pennsylvania. Robert owned one of the area's most popular and longest-running pizzerias. Ghigiarelli's had been a fixture on Main Street since it opened nearly 100 years ago, and Robert took over after his family purchased the business in the 60s. The only thing more important to Robert than the business was his family, many of whom had worked in the restaurant at different points in their lives. To them, Ghigiarelli's was like a second home, a place they felt safe, wanted, and loved. That was, until it became the scene of a violent and vicious crime which to this day remains unsolved. On the morning of Thursday, January 26, 2017, Robert's son arrived at the restaurant after multiple calls to his father had gone unanswered. Inside, he found several items out of place, his father's cell phone, but no sign of Robert himself. Hours later, investigators stared in awe as glowing pools of blood were revealed by luminol, showing that a brutal crime had taken place in the restaurant. The search for Robert and his missing car kicked off almost immediately, but it seemed the more they found, the less it all made sense. What happened to Robert Barron that cold January night? Was he the victim of a robbery gone wrong, a random assault, or was he specifically targeted, perhaps by someone he knew or trusted? This is Trace Evidence, Episode 210, The Disappearance of Robert Barron. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious 2017 disappearance of Robert Barron from Old Forge, Pennsylvania. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. 58-year-old Robert Barron was a well-known, admired, and respected business and family man in Old Forge, Pennsylvania. Then one cold January night, he mysteriously vanished, leaving behind a disturbing crime scene and a lot of unanswered questions. This is episode 210, The Disappearance of Robert Barron. In the late months of 1897, an Italian immigrant named Gennaro Lombardi opened a small grocery store at 32 Spring Street in Manhattan. Operating the little-known shop, Lombardi created a meal which quickly became a local sensation. Known at the time as a tomato pie, the meal often included cheese and other toppings placed inside of a thin crust shell covered over with tomato sauce. 8 years later, in 1905, Lombardi obtained a business license to operate what, to this day, is referred to as the first pizza parlor in the United States. Over the course of the next few decades, pizza would become a key facet of American cuisine, with pizzerias popping up in every major city and expanding outward into more rural areas. More than 100 years later, and pizza continues to reign as one of the country's most popular meals, with statistics showing that 13% of the United States population, or approximately 43 million people, eat pizza every day. As pizza parlors have continued to evolve, so has the style and flavor of the pizzas they create and serve. Several different regional variations have rose to prominence, some of these being Chicago, New York, and St. Louis styles. Whether someone seeks out thin crust, Sicilian, deep dish, or any other combination of styles and toppings, somewhere there's a pizza restaurant that's waiting to supply exactly what you're craving. Depending upon someone's own personal preferences, background, and regional upbringing, there are vastly different opinions about where the best pizza is made. A fun debate, often had amongst friends, dares to ask the question, where exactly would you consider to be the so-called pizza capital of the United States? The two most prominent responses are probably what you would expect, New York or Chicago, and each has its supporters and detractors. However, residents of a borough in Lackawanna County, located in northeastern Pennsylvania, would argue that the pizza available in their little town is so delicious, so finely made and perfectly seasoned, that the borough of Old Forge is, in their eyes, the de facto pizza capital of the country. Creating a unique style known as Old Forge pizza, a rectangular metal pan is utilized for baking. Slices aren't offered, and instead, a customer would find themselves ordering by the tray or cut. Different restaurants in the borough offer their own unique options in addition to many giving the choice between red or white pizza. Lackawanna County is home to more than 160 pizza restaurants and has established itself as a mecca for pizza lovers, so much so that they even provide an official map, the Lackawanna County Pizza Trail, which lists the best local pizzerias as voted on by the community. One of the most famous and popular spots is Ravello's. Established in 1967, Ravello's sits along South Main Street and boasts of visits from celebrities such as Hillary Clinton, Ozzy Osbourne, and former Governor John Hines. However, if it hadn't been for Ghigiarelli's across the street, the concept of Old Forge pizza may never have come to pass, and the so-called pizza capital of the United States might not exist. In 1926, Nani Ghigiarelli, known to locals as Grandma, created the Old Forge style in an attempt to more adequately feed the large numbers of Italian immigrants who had come to the area seeking work in the coal mines. It was Grandma's style that has since been adopted by numerous pizza restaurants in and surrounding Old Forge, all putting their own unique spin on the classic dish. Ghigiarelli's grew quickly and soon became a popular hotspot in Old Forge, drawing in hundreds of customers who developed a love for the thin, crispy crust style. 35 years after the doors opened, in 1961, Ghigiarelli's was purchased by the Barron family, who kept the name and continued creating delicious pizza based upon the original crowd-pleasing recipes. Robert Barron would eventually take over ownership of the restaurant and quickly became what friends and family have semi-humorously referred to as a workaholic. Robert's wife and family would spend a lot of their time at the restaurant, whether the kids were hanging out during summer break or trying to earn a few dollars in their first job. It truly was a family business. Robert, so dedicated to his work, often used an apartment above the restaurant so he could be there early in the morning for deliveries. It was, in a sense, a second home, not just for Robert, but the entire family. Ghigiarelli's and Robert Barron became fixtures of the local community, so ingrained in the daily function of the borough that no one could imagine a day without them. Perhaps that's why so many people took notice on that chilly January morning in 2017 when, for the first time in decades, Ghigiarelli's lights never came on, the doors remained locked, and Robert Barron had seemingly vanished. In January of 2017, Robert Scott Barron was 58 years old and living with his wife, Maria. The couple had 3 children, 2 daughters, Brittany and Nicole, and a son, Robert Jr., usually referred to as Bobby. At the time, Bobby worked with his father and was a partner at Ghigiarelli's, located at 511 South Main Street in Old Forge, and Bobby lived in an apartment a short walk away. On the evening of Wednesday, January 25th, Robert and his son, 30-year-old Bobby, were finishing up closing the restaurant for the night, counting down the register, wiping down tables, and prepping the kitchen for the next day. Just before 11 p.m., the 2 men walked out of the restaurant and climbed into Robert's silver Hyundai Elantra for the short drive to Bobby's apartment, then located along Sussex Street, approximately 7/10 of a mile north of Ghigiarelli's. According to Bobby, the last time he saw his father was at 11 p.m. when he dropped him off, telling him he would pick him up the next day. According to Maria, Robert never arrived home that night, but this was neither out of the ordinary nor cause for alarm. Robert often stayed in the apartment above the restaurant so he could be there for the 7 a.m. dough delivery, and the next day, a delivery was set to arrive. What exactly occurred to Robert after dropping his son off has never been officially determined. However, what we do know is that when Bobby awoke the next morning on Thursday the 26th, he was expecting his father to come and pick him up for work. Normally, Robert would arrive around 7:30, and so when that time came and went, Bobby started calling his father but got no answer. 10 minutes later, at 7:40, Bobby texted his father that he was awake and ready to be picked up, but again, there was no reply. The walk from Bobby's apartment to the restaurant was a short one, taking between 10 and 15 minutes. It was a chilly morning with temperatures lingering below 40 degrees following sunrise, which happened at 7:20. The walk to the restaurant consisted of only 2 turns, a right and a left, and Bobby arrived at approximately 7:55 a.m. From the first moment he got there, Bobby knew something was wrong, as the 7 a.m. dough delivery was sitting outside, neatly stacked against the door. Bobby quickly called his mother to check in on Robert, and when she learned that he wasn't at the restaurant, she too became panicked, jumping in her car and driving down to South Main Street. Upon entering the restaurant, Bobby noted several items that were out of place, and something inside just didn't seem right to him. Walking into the kitchen, Bobby discovered his father's cell phone sitting there, something which he referred to as highly unusual. When she arrived at the restaurant, Maria took a look around but quickly proceeded upstairs to the apartment where Robert often stayed. Perhaps he was ill or, worse yet, injured and had been unable to get to the phone. However, Maria didn't find her husband inside, but what she did see caused tremendous concern. The comforter from the bed was missing, as was a black rolling suitcase. Downstairs, back in the restaurant, an Afghan from the apartment was found in the bar area, something Maria noted as being very out of the ordinary. With no signs of Robert and several indications that something strange had occurred at the restaurant, the Old Forge police were called, and by 9 a.m., dozens of officers were crawling over every inch of the restaurant and apartment. It was quickly discovered that, in addition to Robert, his vehicle was also missing, and so both the Old Forge police as well as the Pennsylvania State Police began looking for the 2006 silver Hyundai Elantra. Inside the pizza restaurant, investigators would find several pieces of evidence which led them to believe that Robert had likely been the victim of a violent attack and had probably been removed from the location by his assailant. According to the Times-Tribune, investigators found several bottles of household cleaners out of place and clear evidence that someone had attempted to clean up a crime scene, and there was broken glass scattered all over the floor. There were several spots of blood which had been missed, and in an effort to get a more vibrant image of what may have happened, authorities brought in luminol and began spraying down the restaurant in search of additional evidence. There they found enough blood to indicate that whatever had happened to Robert, it could have been fatal. Outside of the blood found throughout the restaurant, tests run on the Afghan found in the bar also showed that there was blood on the material. Another grim indication was found when crime scene investigators discovered a single human tooth in a utility sink. Over the course of Thursday and Friday, the 26th and 27th, the police presence at Ghigiarelli's only increased as thorough searches were conducted both up and downstairs. Bags of evidence were seen being removed from the restaurant, and at one point, witnesses stated that it appeared one item removed from the building was a laptop. Then, Lackawanna County District Attorney Shane Scanlon spoke to reporters outside of the restaurant, giving a small update on the investigation. Scanlon stated, quote, "I will say that, in conjunction with the Pennsylvania State Police, we did conduct an investigation looking for potential evidence. Again, right now, it's a missing persons case. What I would like to say at this point in time, we don't have any evidence of him being dead. We certainly have not found a body or a deceased person. We are asking that if anyone out in the public has any information or has seen Mr. Barron going all the way back to Tuesday, to please give the Lackawanna County Communications Center a call." End quote. Despite the blood and evidence found, investigators continue to approach the case as that of a missing person. Initially, a theory developed that perhaps Robert had returned to the restaurant after dropping off Bobby and went upstairs to sleep. Something during the night may have roused him, whether that was someone calling, knocking, or perhaps the sounds of someone entering the building. Regardless, it was thought that perhaps Robert had been abducted in an attempt to obtain money, but there had been no calls, no letters, and no ransom demands. Given that Robert's car was also missing, there were some who, despite the evidence found, considered it possible that the restaurant owner may have chosen to leave of his own volition. To Robert's friends and family, though, this possibility was quickly dismissed. Robert was a dedicated member of the community, a business owner, and a devoted family man. No one who knew him believed he'd have just run off without telling anyone. Linda Tomlinson, the owner of a flower shop next door to Ghigiarelli's, was shocked to learn of the disappearance. She explained her experience with Robert, telling ABC News, quote, the best neighbor you want to meet, always good to us. When we moved in, he sent over a couple of trays of pizza to greet us and just so nice. We'd meet him in the backyard, and he's just so friendly, nice conversation. We're hoping for the best, end quote. When the sun rose on Saturday, January 28th, Robert hadn't been seen for over 60 hours, and no one had any idea where he could be. The doors to Ghigiarelli's remained locked, with a handwritten sign taped to the glass reading, closed for business. Beneath the sign, lying on the ground in front of the door, were several flowers and notes from local business owners hoping that Robert would be found quickly and safely. This same day, investigators issued a request through the media asking that any businesses in the area of the restaurant who used surveillance cameras that please contact them so they might review the footage from the hours surrounding Robert's disappearance. Detectives got a big break on the morning of Sunday the 29th when Robert's car was located in the 100 block of Howard Street, approximately 7/10 of a mile south of the restaurant and just over 100 feet from the curving flow of the Lackawanna River. Unfortunately, the vehicle would ultimately provide investigators with far more questions than answers. One curious detail, however, came up when detectives noted the area in which the car was found had been previously searched. According to detectives, the car had not been in that spot when they started searching, suggesting that someone had parked it there after Robert had already been reported missing. Gene Ricardo, first assistant district attorney, specified their belief that the vehicle had been moved and then returned. He explained, quote, it wasn't parked at that spot where we found it for a period of time, end quote. According to an affidavit for a search warrant filed on Sunday morning, Robert's car was described as having excessive mud on all four tires as well as the undercarriage. In addition, traces of blood were found in 3 different areas inside the car: on the passenger side front door, on the door frame near the front passenger seat, and on a piece of paper on the floor in the front seat area. There was also blood found on the exterior of the rear driver's side door. Investigators would also find latent prints on 5 separate door handles. In hopes of trying to determine where the vehicle had been during the period of time that it was missing, soil samples were taken from the mud on the car and sent to the state police lab for analysis, along with the blood evidence from the car and the restaurant and the tooth that had been found in the sink. In total, 30 items were sent off for testing. One interesting piece of evidence found inside the car may have nothing to do with Robert's disappearance, but many have been drawn to it. Detectives located paperwork from a civil lawsuit which Robert had won just a month prior, in December of 2016. Robert had received $14,500 in a default judgment. Whether or not Robert may have been targeted as a result of this judgment has been debated back and forth, although most people close with the family do not believe there's any direct connection, and while law enforcement looked into the possibility, they never found anything to make them believe that the crime and the civil suit were related. That same day the car was found, on Sunday, detectives conducted a search near Coxton Road in Durye, a borough approximately 2 miles south of Old Forge. This particular area that they focused in on was approximately 2 miles southwest from where Robert's car had been found. This path follows the Lackawanna River as it curves southwest towards where it meets the Susquehanna River. Why exactly this area became their primary point of search that day has never been revealed. Some have speculated they may have been operating under the assumption that Robert had been thrown in the river and may have floated towards the Susquehanna. When asked why they had searched that area, Jason Dubernas, chief of the Old Forge Police, said he couldn't comment as it was an ongoing investigation. On Monday, January 30th, more than 100 people gathered at Ray's Market, a local grocery store, to organize a search for Robert. Much of the search would be conducted on foot, with countless searchers heading back down to the 100 block of Howard Street, from which they would walk along the banks of the Lackawanna, looking for any indications that someone may have been dumped or assaulted there. This would be the first of many searches conducted primarily by friends, family members, and volunteers who either knew Robert or simply wanted to try and help find a man described by so many as a good, kind-hearted father and business owner. In hopes of drumming up new information, the Barron family announced they would be offering a $5,000 reward for any information leading to Robert's whereabouts. Another search was conducted on Tuesday the 31st, though the number of volunteers was negatively impacted by snow and cold temperatures that dipped into the 20s. Only around 15 to 20 people showed up to help that morning. Robert Mulkerin, then mayor of Old Forge, joined in with the volunteers as they searched in the area surrounding the restaurant on South Main Street. Groups of searchers looked up and down every street and side alley, digging through piles of refuse and crawling into dumpsters in search of any trace of Robert or the person or persons responsible for his disappearance. They even spread out and went over the vast and dangerous terrain of an old industrial site, but unfortunately, nothing of importance was found. Investigators were of the belief that someone in the local community had information that could assist them, with District Attorney Shane Scanlon stating, quote, "I think every day we work harder, we get closer, we talk to someone, we need that one person who knows something to give us a call. I can tell you that law enforcement is extremely concerned for the safety and well-being of Mr. Barron at this point. We've been in contact with the family for their sake. For the sake of the community, we'd love to find Mr. Barron. We'd love to find him safe. We'd like to get that done." End quote. As a result of the searches on top of the massive media attention focused on Robert's disappearance, a lot of rumors began making their way into the mainstream. From social media posts to conversations around local shops and bars, everyone seemed to have an idea of what might have happened, and in the absence of any actual evidence, they were more than happy to entertain baseless speculation. Both the mayor and law enforcement asked people to be more careful with what they were posting, but the cat was already out of the bag, and as a result, investigators began holding back more information, not wanting it to leak out and create a new series of rumors and wild theories. Wednesday, February 1st, marked a full week since Robert had last been seen, but the investigation wasn't turning up a large number of leads and had failed to uncover additional evidence in the days following the discovery of the car. While Old Forge is home to a small population, local investigators noted that the borough was rife with hard-to-find spots, secluded ravines and ditches, and all of those would need to be thoroughly searched. While friends and family continued searching, focusing in on where the car had been found, as well as a large brushy area near Maxon Drive and in the hills of Silby Avenue, investigators kept gathering surveillance footage, interviewing people, and impatiently awaiting the results of tests conducted on evidence sent to the state lab. On Thursday, February 2nd, investigators kicked their search efforts into high gear. According to ABC News, state troopers began scouring wooded areas of Lackawanna County while local police focused in on 2 areas of Old Forge. Police and firefighters from more than a dozen agencies throughout the state took part in this search. Approximately 50 state troopers slowly searched side by side in a long line through the woods, making their way several miles into neighboring Luzerne County. A dive team was sent down to the Lackawanna River to begin searching near where the car was found, following the flow west. Teams of tracking and cadaver dogs were also utilized, searching in an area behind Pagnotti Park, approximately 1 mile north of Coxton Road, northwest from where the car was found on Howard Street. This was the second time detectives returned to search this area near the park, though what led them there has never been revealed. There was also a search conducted in Campbell's Ledge, 2 miles west of Pagnotti Park. This area was searched on foot, through the use of ATVs, and by air. Nothing appears to have been found, though this was another new location investigators had zeroed in on, but no one was sure what had taken them there. Searchers were joined by members of the Northeast Search and Rescue Team, based out of Stroudsburg, and it was announced that officials were working to organize a larger search over the weekend. Asked why they were seemingly researching certain areas and increasing the number of searchers in specific locations, District Attorney Scanlon didn't wish to release any specific information. Instead, he explained, quote, "What we're doing is looking at areas that are tied into where our investigation has been, where we've had tips and leads. As the area grows or information grows, then we'll follow those tips. You have to understand that in the initial days of this search, we were looking for a vehicle. We have located the vehicle. We're now looking for Mr. Barron. There are some places we're going to have to go back and research." End quote. Wednesday, February 15th, marked 3 weeks since Robert had gone missing and little, if anything, had been learned. Details about what led up to what was seeming more and more like an abduction or homicide were few and far between. As much of the media attention around the case began stagnating, locals were growing restless for answers. As for Robert's family, they were beginning to wonder just how seriously investigators were taking the case. They started to feel as though maybe things hadn't been handled as well as they could have been from the get-go, and that Robert was not a priority. In response, the family doubled the reward offer, increasing it to $10,000. Asked about those who believed the investigators weren't working hard enough, District Attorney Scanlon told the Times-Tribune, quote, "This is still an absolute priority investigation. This investigation is just as intense as it was on day one. We've been asking the public for help, and we're going to be renewing that request today." End quote. More than 2 months after Robert vanished in late March, investigators finally received the results of their lab tests. While not all of the information obtained was revealed by law enforcement, District Attorney Scanlon's office did report that the tooth found in the utility sink, as well as blood evidence recovered in the restaurant, was a match to Robert Barron. While results from tests conducted on other pieces of evidence had also come in, Scanlon didn't wish to share that, and went on to specify that all of the DNA analysis which confirmed Robert's blood was based upon evidence found at the restaurant and nowhere else. Scanlon noted the importance of the evidence, stating, quote, "It at least confirms the fact that he experienced some type of blood loss, some type of event happened there involving him." End quote. Just over a week later, on Saturday, April 8th, more than 100 people gathered outside of Ghigiarelli's for a candlelight vigil. Through smiles and tears, friends and family spoke of Robert and of their desperation to bring him home. In addition to their $10,000 reward, the family announced they had raised another $5,000 to offer for information. Robert's daughter, Brittany, was present and spoke about her confusion over why anyone would want to harm her father. She stated, quote, "Everything he does for his family. If you're good to him, he'll be even better to you. No clue who would bother him. He had no problems with anyone. He's the greatest man ever. He's our world." End quote. Robert's wife, Maria, also spoke and thanked everyone for their continued support during that incredibly difficult and painful time. She reinforced the family's belief that they were going to find Robert and bring him home, with their older daughter, Nicole, adding, quote, "The only thing that gets me through the days and nights is believing that I'm going to see him again." End quote. Less than a week later, news broke that a 54-year-old woman, Sharon Grisenda, had been arrested, and while initially many believed the arrest was related to Robert's disappearance, as it would turn out, Grisenda had not been charged in connection with that crime. Instead, Grisenda, who had been hired as a nurse to take care of Robert's mother, was charged with theft, forgery, and receiving stolen property. Investigators accused Grisenda of stealing more than $36,000 from the bank account of 86-year-old Helen Barron, who Grisenda had been working for since January of 2016. The arrest affidavit stated that Grisenda wrote more than 50 unauthorized checks on 2 separate accounts in Helen's name. Most of the checks were made payable to Anne, Grisenda's mother, and then endorsed by Grisenda and Anne, although investigators believed that the signatures were both written by the same hand. 3 checks totaling $5,200 were directly written to Grisenda, and another for $1,350 was written out to a Randall Grisenda. According to the Barron family, they paid Grisenda in cash on a weekly basis, and there was never a time where any check should have been written to her. 3 checks totaling $3,341 went to Creative Benefits Incorporated and was used to pay for Cobra insurance plans opened in Grisenda's name through St. Joseph Center, where she used to work. A check from December for $1,125 had been written to Grzybowski Landscaping and was used to cover work conducted at Grisenda's Winfield Avenue home. Richard Grzybowski told investigators that Grisenda had included a note on the check saying that it was from her mother's account. Maria Barron, Robert's wife, later told investigators that her husband had made payments to Grisenda up until October of 2016, at which time he asked her to take over, saying he didn't get along with Grisenda and it would just be easier for someone else to deal with her. While Grisenda's arrest added a new layer to the investigation, there doesn't appear to have been any connection established. Initially, there was a belief that maybe Robert had become aware of the scam and informed Grisenda of plans to contact authorities, but no evidence has ever been located or revealed to confirm this. Investigators were somewhat dismissive of a potential connection, stating their belief that the fraud case was unrelated to Robert's disappearance. On that front, however, they had made very little progress. Missing persons flyers and signs put up around Old Forge began taking on a different shape, and rather than simply listing the pertinent information, they started including the final line, "Someone here knows where he is." For many locals, it was a difficult situation, not just because of Robert's disappearance, but also the uneasy concept that the person or persons responsible might be friends, neighbors, or even customers they see every day. A large billboard was erected along the northbound lanes of I-81 in Moosic, 2 miles south of Old Forge. The billboard displayed photos of Robert and the details of his disappearance, as well as advertising the reward for information. Jason Thomas, a friend of Robert's, expressed his and the family's frustration with the lack of information thus discovered, telling the Times-Tribune, quote, "Somebody knows what happened, and it's just a matter of them coming forward and giving it up. I personally think that, and I think there are probably 1 or 2 people in particular who know exactly what happened and just won't come forward." End quote. Thomas noted that while he hoped for the best, he was no longer clinging to the belief that Robert was alive and acknowledged the painful reality that he was likely searching for his friend's body. While many spoke about Robert, the investigation, and the possibilities, investigators themselves were noticeably quiet. They would remain that way throughout the rest of the year as, following the arrival of spring, everything went silent. Asked for comment about potential persons of interest or suspects or anything, Chief Dubernas simply replied, quote, "You know how small towns are. Everybody has assumptions. Everybody has their own thoughts. As new leads develop, we follow up on them." End quote. Sadly, 2017 would come to an end without any major updates, developments, or breaks in the case. January of 2018 marked a full year since Robert had last been seen, and it appeared investigators were no closer to finding the answers. In fact, there wouldn't be any new details revealed or any insights into the investigation throughout the entire year of 2018. By January of 2019, 2 years had passed, and while detectives continued to work the investigation, the frustration of family and friends was beginning to boil over. If law enforcement couldn't bring Robert home nor find those responsible for his disappearance, perhaps friends and family could. For 2 long years, Ghigiarelli's remained a fixture on Main Street, though its doors never opened. The landmark business, started nearly 100 years earlier, had grown dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling hotspot it once was. A sign, added to the exterior of the building, showed a picture of Robert and big bold letters reading, "Please help find Robert Barron. Someone here knows where he is. $10,000 reward for bringing him home." Maria, Brittany, and Nicole sat down for an interview with the Times-Tribune to discuss Robert, the investigation, the restaurant, and their own beliefs 2 years later. Maria acknowledged that she often debated opening the restaurant back up, but the family found it too difficult to go there, let alone to work. Both Brittany and Nicole refused to drive past the restaurant, the memories sweeping in too powerfully and painfully. Asked about the possibility of selling the location, Maria replied, quote, "It's going to be bittersweet, but I don't think we can sell it. This is a landmark for over 100 years now." End quote. Discussing the crime, the family acknowledged that Ghigiarelli's was a cash business, and this may have been what it was all about, an attempt to rob a business owner that went horribly wrong. At the same time, Robert wasn't known to carry large sums of money on him, and they didn't keep a lot of cash around the restaurant. Given that Robert was last seen on a Wednesday night, he couldn't have had more than a few $100 from that evening's customers. According to Brittany, if her father had seen someone in need, he would have done all he could to help them. But she also believed if someone had broken into the restaurant or tried to rob him, Robert most certainly would have fought back. She stated, quote, "All he did was work at the restaurant and raise his family. It just blows my mind that someone would have gone in and bothered him like this." End quote. In an attempt to gather information and spread awareness about the case, the family created a Facebook page which you can still follow today entitled Finding Robert Barron. There, a lot of information has been shared over the years, and if you look closely, a few names have been thrown around as possibly having been involved. According to the family, they believe that more than one person was involved in what became a botched robbery, which led to them murdering Robert and disposing of his body. Not only that, but unlike investigators, the family are not quiet about the fact that they have their own suspects. As Brittany explained, quote, "We have a very good idea of who is involved." End quote. Since law enforcement has never directly named anyone as a suspect, let alone a person of interest, I'm not going to get into specific names mentioned on that Facebook page. You can find them if you want to. However, it does seem apparent that the family has a few people in mind who they believe, at a minimum, know more about what happened to Robert and, at most, were directly involved. The family also expressed their beliefs that the investigation may not have initially been handled as well as they could have hoped, leading many to wonder if perhaps the original investigation had been flawed. Brittany was very clear on her view, telling the Times, quote, "Nothing was handled right from the start. There could have been so much evidence found there if they handled it correctly." End quote. Mark Powell, who took over as Lackawanna County District Attorney, dismissed these statements, saying, quote, "Since I took office as District Attorney in 2018, we have gone over every aspect of the investigation with a fine-tooth comb. What was done, what wasn't done, and what needed to be redone. And we have followed through whenever we felt it was necessary and appropriate." End quote. Powell went on to say that the case was still being investigated, terming it as active rather than cold. Unfortunately, much as had been the case for the previous years, 2019 would come to its conclusion with no new developments, and soon, January 25th, 2020, marked 3 years since Robert had vanished. However, 4 months later in May, investigators returned to the restaurant. Daniel Pillitz Jr., senior trial counsel for the district attorney's office, stated that investigators had gone back to the restaurant to do additional investigatory work, though Pillitz noted that was all he was allowed to say. According to an article in the Citizen's Voice, investigators were spotted at several different locations taking photographs and marking the street with spray paint. A yellow T was painted on the street in front of 401 Sussex Street, the apartment where Bobby had lived. Other officers were seen walking along Coxton Road, looking into a field on the north side of St. John's Creek. Detective Chris Calcharno took photographs at 2 separate locations, behind the old UPS store on South Main Street and the front of a residential home located at 3 Foundry Street, 1 mile southwest of Ghigiarelli's. Asked about the reason for these photos and the spray painting, neither DA Mark Powell nor Old Forge Police Chief Jason Dubernas provided any comment about the continuing investigation. Now, it may be worth noting that at least the Foundry Street address is associated with one of the names mentioned on the family's Facebook page, which, lacking evidence, doesn't carry a lot of weight, but it's certainly a curious detail. What exactly caused investigators to return to these locations is unknown, though it doesn't appear that very much came out of this aspect of the investigation. As quickly as the media began reporting on this new angle of the case, reports about Robert's disappearance once again started fading, and the absence of any new information given by law enforcement resulted in the case once again growing quiet. January of 2021 marked 4 years since Robert had disappeared, and yet there hadn't been any progress made on the investigation, at least nothing they had told. Hoping to keep Robert's name in the papers and his case alive, Maria, Brittany, and Nicole all sat down for an interview with WNEP, ABC News 16. It was during this interview that, for the first time, they revealed a piece of evidence which had previously gone unreported. Surveillance video, captured by a local business 2 blocks from the restaurant the night of Robert's disappearance, is considered a key piece of evidence by the family. One video clip shows a man in shorts walking near Main Street just after midnight on January 26th, approximately 8 hours prior to Robert being reported missing. According to the family, the man seen in this footage closely matches up with a witness statement describing a man that was seen outside of Ghigiarelli's less than an hour earlier at approximately 11 p.m. when Robert was dropping off his son. This man is identifiable in the video, however, WNEP 16 News blurred his face when showing the clip. The second video shows a man holding a lit cigarette and pulling a dark-colored rolling suitcase behind him. At the same time, the man from the first video is seen again, walking back from the direction he'd originally been heading. According to the family, the suitcase seen in the video closely resembles the piece of luggage noted as being missing from the apartment above Ghigiarelli's. Maria told WNEP that she distinctly remembered bringing the suitcase up to that apartment and storing it, but now it couldn't be found. According to the family, they turned this video over to investigators, but nothing ever came of it. Asked their thoughts about the investigation, all 3 women shared a similar sentiment, describing it as awful. Asked about the video, the district attorney's office would only say that the case was still being investigated, but they couldn't comment on specific people or evidence. District Attorney Powell stated, quote, "We are certainly aware of the videotape. I sympathize with anyone who lost a loved one. Our office has worked in conjunction with outside agencies and really has left no stone unturned. This is not a cold case. It's very active. We are following leads, and we'll get to the truth of what happened to Mr. Barron. We can't say much more so as not to jeopardize the ongoing investigation. We continue to investigate the violent disappearance and likely homicide of Robert Barron." End quote. According to Robert's brother, Mark Barron, investigators were not only in possession of the surveillance video from the beginning, he believed they had gone and interviewed the people seen in the footage. Mark, along with other family members, began pushing for another agency to get involved. Mark explained, quote, "After this amount of time, even I would have to say, you know what? Let somebody else take a look at it." End quote. According to the family, investigators stopped sharing new information with them as they feared revealing too much might negatively impact the investigation. Despite such an atrocious crime occurring in what everyone describes as a kind and caring, tight-knit community, the answers have remained evasive. That, however, does not imply that no one knows what happened. The family, though somewhat divided in their beliefs regarding motive, have no doubt that the perpetrators were local to Old Forge, knew the area, knew Robert, and are probably still living in the area. While some believe that Robert was specifically targeted, others theorize that perhaps it was all a robbery gone wrong. The one detail the family absolutely agree on is that there was nothing random about this crime. Even if it had been, they find it difficult to accept that people aren't aware of more than what they've shared. With Brittany explaining, quote, "It's such a small town, there's no way there was nothing seen." End quote. January of 2022 marked 5 years since the loving father of 3 and respected local businessman vanished after dropping off his son at 11 p.m. on the evening of Wednesday, January 25th, 2017. The last major update on the case was the family's releasing of the surveillance footage, but, as has been the case for most of this investigation, little, if anything, has developed since then. The family have expressed both their frustration and anger, wondering why, after 5 years, the case remains unsolved. They, it seems, were not the only ones, as an unknown person added to the sign stuck to the outside of Ghigiarelli's. Bold letters written in black marker now ask, 5 years, no Bob, no arrests, why? It's a question the family would love to have answered. Asked her own thoughts, how she feels about the investigation, Maria didn't hold back, saying, quote, a lot of anger, very, very saddened. I never would have thought it would come to this. 5 years later, no answers in a small town. End quote. That was a sentiment shared not just by the family, but also a large portion of the community. How could so much time have passed without so much as a person of interest, a matched print, any solid evidence which might bring the truth into light? Robert's daughter, Nicole, was very clear that not only did the family believe they knew who was involved, but those people were still around. She explained, quote, I just feel strongly that the people, and I said people, as in plural, who are responsible for this tragedy are very close to us in the town of Old Forge. End quote. Sadly, while those responsible may still be close to home, Robert Barron remains missing and, for the most part, is presumed deceased. Next month, January of 2023, will tragically mark 6 years since Robert vanished, and frustratingly, it appears that whatever people may hold pieces of this puzzle, all this time later, they still refuse to come forward, instead protecting the vile scum who robbed a wife of her husband, a family of their father, and a town of one of its strongest pillars. When last seen, Robert Scott Barron was described as a white male with gray hair and hazel eyes, standing 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighing approximately 185 pounds. Robert was last seen wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt, black sweatpants, and black sneakers. Robert wore glasses at the time of his disappearance. According to his son, Bobby, Robert was last seen when he dropped him off at his Sussex Street apartment around 11 p.m. Based upon evidence found at the scene, it appears clear that Robert either returned to the restaurant or was forced to, at which time a violent and vicious assault took place. Robert was apparently then removed from that location and transported, likely in his own vehicle. His car, a 2006 silver Hyundai Elantra, was located 4 days later in the 100 block of Howard Street, 7/10 of a mile south of the restaurant and not far from the Lackawanna River. At the time of his disappearance, Robert was 58 years old, and if alive today, he would be turning 64 next month. A high-profile crime in a small, close community. A prominent local business owner mysteriously vanishes, leaving behind evidence of a brutal crime and indications that those responsible attempted to clean up after themselves. More than 5 years have passed, and while many believe they know the names of those responsible, investigators have never managed to find enough evidence to charge anyone. For the Barron family, it's a terrifying and horrible reality. To see their family business, doors locked and lights out, day after day, as the people responsible for Robert's disappearance continue to walk the streets, free and fearless. Perhaps after so much time, someone might finally be ready to tell what they know. Robert's daughter, Brittany, has a simple request. Quote, I really don't think those people involved have a heart. Even if you know something and you're not involved, covering up for those people, what is benefiting you to cover up for them? This man is our life. We don't know where he is. If you do, you could be anonymous about it. Just have a heart. Nearly 6 years ago, 58-year-old Robert Barron mysteriously disappeared after dropping his son off at 11 p.m. 9 hours later, police were called down to Ghigiarelli's, the pizza restaurant Barron owned. There, investigators found blood, hair, and a tooth, as well as evidence that someone had attempted to clean up the scene of what appeared to have been a brutal and vicious assault. 4 days later, Robert's missing car was found in an area which had been previously searched. There was blood in several locations, inside and outside of the vehicle, which itself was caked in thick mud, suggesting it had been driven off-road sometime after Robert vanished. While the investigation into Robert's disappearance kicked off within an hour of the missing persons report, nearly 6 years later the answers remain obscured. To date, no person of interest or suspect has ever been named, no motive has been revealed, and no arrests have been made. While local law enforcement assured the family and the community that Robert's case was a top priority for them, the passage of time and lack of developments has led many to believe that the case wasn't properly handled. While some chalk this up purely to a lack of skill or knowledge on the part of detectives, others have argued that either the entire investigation was a complex cover-up or they were in some other way going out of their way to protect the assailants for reasons unknown. Discussing this case, it would probably be easier to focus in on what we know for certain, as there are a lot of aspects to this investigation which remain unknown. For the most part, there are two diverging pathways people take when approaching Robert's case. This was all the result of a random robbery gone wrong, or Robert was specifically targeted by someone he knew, or perhaps someone who knew him, but who Robert had no solid relationship with. So we'll begin with the random possibility and work our way towards something more personal. Old Forge has a crime rating of 78, on a scale where 100 denotes a location is safest. In its annual report, Old Forge noted 12 violent crimes and 38 property crimes in a given year. As compared to the rest of the state, Old Forge residents have a 1 in 708 chance of being the victim of a violent crime, whereas for Pennsylvania as a whole, residents have a 1 in 261 chance. Most locals refer to Old Forge as a quiet, nice little community where people know one another and no one worries all that much about the potential for crime. But that being said, no place is free from crime, and Old Forge is no different. However, Robert's disappearance and the apparently violent nature of the way in which he was taken stood out in stark contrast to what law enforcement in Old Forge was used to dealing with. Given the way the community views the borough, it was initially theorized that Robert had likely been the victim of a random robbery, and somewhere along the line, things had gone sideways. Whether Robert fought back or was beaten in an attempt to get money, no one knows for sure. However, the crime scene tells a disturbing story which suggests that if Robert left the restaurant alive that night, he didn't remain that way for long. One of the first things people questioned when it came to the random robbery theory was the state of the restaurant. Most people believe that were the crime random, there wouldn't have been any need to try and clean up the scene, nor would there have been the requirement to remove Robert from that location. If Robert had been killed inside the restaurant, why would someone or a group of random people go out of their way to try and clean up the blood, remove physical evidence, and dispose of the body? To many, that sounds a little too planned out to simply be a random crime. On top of that, you'd have to wonder about how Robert and or Ghigiarelli's was chosen. While the restaurant was well known throughout the area, a random Wednesday night in the late stages of January seems like a really strange time to target a business for robbery, at least if a large sum of money was being sought. Given what Bobby told investigators, it seems most likely that after dropping off his son, Robert headed back down to the restaurant where he was potentially planning to stay in the upstairs apartment. This he frequently did so that he could be there early in the morning to accept deliveries. Of course, after Robert drove off that night, we have no way of knowing what happened. However, given that there were no statements issued about any signs of forced entry or a break-in, only a handful of things could have happened next. Either Robert got to the restaurant and found someone waiting outside for him, or by the time he'd returned, someone had already gained entry. Another possibility some have floated is the idea that Robert may have gone upstairs and been preparing for bed when someone knocked on the door, called out, and Robert went downstairs to see who it was or to find out what was needed. Given that the Afghan from the apartment was found in the bar area with Robert's blood on it, and the comforter was never located, many theorized that Robert may have had the Afghan wrapped around himself when he came downstairs to see who was there. But it's from this point that everything about a random crime goes out the window. Obviously, a violent assault took place in the restaurant that night. Now, if the assailants were seeking money, it seems strange that Robert wouldn't have handed it over, especially once it became apparent that he couldn't overcome the odds. Even if he had given the suspects the money, and then they had elected to continue beating him, possibly to death, why wouldn't they have just left at that point? It's highly unusual that, in the process of a simple robbery, the decision would be made not only to kill Robert, but to remove him from the building, transport him with his own car, and dispose of him in a location where nearly 6 years later, he's never been found. Now, I have to ask, what sounds more like a random robbery to you? Police arrive at the restaurant and find a bloody mess with Robert lying dead in the pizza shop and the cash register open, or police find evidence of a cleanup, a stolen vehicle moved after the crime, but no traces of the missing business owner and no mentions of missing money? Certainly, it could have gone that way, but for the most part, it seems more likely that once things turned bad, the assailants would have taken whatever cash they could get their hands on and then fled. One of the only reasons to try and clean up, to attempt to destroy evidence, and to remove Robert and perhaps other items from the scene would be to create distance between suspect and investigator. If this were a random group, then they likely wouldn't have had any direct connections to Robert or Ghigiarelli's. But considering what evidence we do have, many believe it suggests that there was nothing random about this crime at all. So, looking towards the possibility that Robert was targeted, we have even more unanswered questions to address. The first would be motive. Now, in a random situation, it's pretty easy to define the motive: robbery, money, whatever. However, if it were targeted, you've got to look a little deeper. One of the first questions to ask is the most basic question in criminal investigation: who stood to benefit from Robert's demise? It doesn't appear that he owed anyone money. The business had been in his family for more than 50 years, so it's not like he stole it from someone or took it over from someone, creating jealousy or anger. Here's the thing about this case that continues to bother me more than anything else. No one in the family, no investigators, and no reporters have ever stated whether or not any money was actually taken. According to the family, Robert didn't keep a lot of money on hand at the shop. They estimated that after Wednesday's business, there was likely only a few $100s in the register. That seems like a paltry sum of money to kill someone over, and yet, if indeed the persons responsible were locals or even knew Robert, then they'd also have to have been aware that they weren't going to find a ton of money in Ghigiarelli's that night. So, what led them there in the first place? I mentioned during the evidence section that the family runs a Facebook page, and that a lot of names have been tossed back and forth in terms of possibly being involved. This is no small list, and while I won't share any of the names given, I do think it's worth noting that quite a few names have come up time and time again. One person made a strange accusation in a public post, stating that one of the named parties had been selling something he shouldn't have been to Robert's son Bobby. In some instances, it suggested that he may have been referencing drugs, but in other spots, it's hinted that it could have been some kind of gambling situation. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot to go on with that. However, I do think it's worth noting that not even family members are free from suspicion in this case. Many people have brought up the possibility that Robert may have been targeted not because of something he had done or someone he knew, but perhaps because one of his children may have been connected with some unsavory folks. As a result, there's a lot of rumors that Robert was targeted because one of his kids owed someone money for one thing or another, and after attempts to obtain money from that kid failed, they decided to go straight to the source. This is perhaps one of the more interesting, if not very controversial, theories about this case. One poster on the Facebook page reported that a local woman had confided in her that she feared her son may have been involved and that Robert was killed and then disposed of in a car crusher at a junkyard. Another woman stated her belief that Robert was killed over a drug debt and that the assailants didn't plan to kill him, instead had hoped to beat him into handing over money to settle the debt. Somewhere along the line, things went wrong and Robert was killed, which led this person to dispose of his body in a river. Both of these are interesting takes, but at least publicly, neither supplied any hard proof about the accusations, and for their part, law enforcement has continued to refuse to comment about specific people or pieces of evidence. It's important to keep in mind that these are theories, posted on a public Facebook page with nothing to back them up or support them. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're false, although it's quite clear you can't rely on them without some evidentiary foundation to support them. However, it really is interesting that not only does the family leave these comments up, in some instances, they reply and engage with the posters. At least some comments have been passed on to law enforcement, according to the page's moderators. While I don't believe any of us removed from this case are in any position to comment about potential suspects, I do think the idea that Robert was targeted not because of his own actions, but perhaps a family member or close friends, makes a lot more sense than the idea that a few random people decided to rob a pizza joint after it was closed and instead killed the owner, cleaned up the scene, stole his car, disposed of his body, and then left the car to be found 4 days later. I think perhaps the reason so much of this case remains embedded in mystery has to do with motive, which we talked about earlier. Now, the family has made it clear they believe this was all about money. Pure and simple, Robert was likely killed because someone was looking for cash. Whether or not cash was owed to that person, or if that person simply thought Robert had some laying around, we simply don't know. If you examine this case from top to bottom, there's not a whole lot which would lead one to believe that the crime was random, that it was perpetrated by people unfamiliar with Old Forge, or that Robert was not targeted. So what does that leave you with? Someone, for reasons unknown, decided to go after Robert that night. Maybe it really was all about money, or maybe there was something more to it. Either way, when you factor in cleaning up the scene, disposing of the body, and no reports of actual money missing, this doesn't sound like a robbery at all. Instead, it sounds like a group of people went after Robert that night with the full intention to kill him, and after having done so, went out of their way to try and erase any evidence which might tie them to the crime. If true, this would again support the possibility that the assailants knew Robert, or at a minimum were familiar with the restaurant. I would argue you're also probably looking at people who have criminal histories, probably with some violence in them, who aren't the type to freak out after committing a murder. There's nothing here that feels like it was done out of a rush or a panic. They took the time to find the cleaners, to get down on the floor and scrub up as much of the blood as they could. They obviously washed some evidence down the sink, resulting in one of Robert's teeth getting stuck in the drain. They then removed his body, perhaps using that rolling black suitcase that went missing. At that point, Robert was either transferred into his own vehicle, which was used to dispose of him, or while someone took his body, someone else took his car. Perhaps to add confusion, maybe with the intent of selling it, but then the case got too hot. Speaking of that suitcase, the surveillance footage released by the family is very interesting to watch, and while nothing really happens on the tape, it does show that at least 2 people were hanging out in the area around Ghigiarelli's in the hours leading up to and following when Robert dropped Bobby off at his apartment. One figure is difficult to make out, wearing a large, puffy-looking coat and walking mostly in shadow while smoking a cigarette. It's this dark figure which can be seen pulling the rolling suitcase behind him. The other video shows an unknown male wearing shorts in what was a very cold night, walking around in the same area. When the man with the suitcase makes his way down the street, the man in the other video seemingly turns around and begins walking back towards the way he'd originally come from. Do the men in those videos know something more about what happened to Robert that night? Surely, only they can say for certain. However, I think it's entirely worth considering there's a high probability that, as that dark figure made his way down the street, Robert Barron's body may very well have been in that suitcase he was pulling behind him. According to some, investigators did manage to question the men seen on these videos. Neither has ever been charged nor named as a person of interest. Finally, I think it's worth mentioning the dissatisfaction both the family and the community feel about the way this investigation was handled. Whether you believe investigators were simply unskilled, or if you'd go far enough to suggest that there may be some kind of a cover-up, it seems quite obvious that this case has its share of controversy. While the family has requested that another law enforcement agency take over the case, such as the FBI, the Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office has refused to get anyone else involved or to hand over that case file. Why? After more than 5 years, maybe it would be best to hand it over, unless there really is something to hide. So what do you believe happened here? Did Robert Barron fall victim to one of the most bizarre and violent random robberies in recent memory? Or was the 58-year-old husband and father of three targeted by someone who either wanted money or to hurt Robert or his family? Sadly, nearly 6 years later, it appears we are no closer to knowing the truth than we were the day Robert was reported missing. While the family believes they know who was responsible, investigators have never commented about those accusations or even so much as to whether or not they've looked into the people they've been told about. Either way, it appears quite clear the family is absolutely right. Someone there in Old Forge knows exactly where Robert is. Unfortunately, unless new evidence is found, someone comes forward, or Robert himself is located, the disappearance of Robert Barron will remain open, unsolved, and growing cold. Case update. Human remains have been recovered by investigators conducting a search in connection to the disappearance of Robert Barron. On Tuesday, March 28, 2023, Old Forge police were joined by county and state investigators, as well as agents out of the FBI's Scranton office and members of the New York State Police who brought with them specially trained dogs to aid in the search. On Wednesday, March 29th, all searchers returned and were this time joined by the county coroner as well as an anthropology team from Mercyhurst University in Erie. The search focused in on an area known as Connell's Patch, approximately 1 mile southwest from the restaurant, and it is notable for its close proximity to Pagnotti Park, which it butts up against. This is an area which had previously been the subject of different searches for Robert. According to local reports, police vehicles blocked off all entry to the park and surrounding areas, with the only traffic being the arrival and departure of different law enforcement vehicles. On Tuesday, March 28th, multiple Lackawanna County agencies posted messages on their Facebook pages. Their notice read in part, quote, "As many are aware by now, there is significant law enforcement activity ongoing in the Connell's Patch section of Old Forge related to the active investigation into the suspicious disappearance of Robert Barron Sr. 6 years ago." End quote. At the bottom of this message, law enforcement renewed their request for assistance from the public by posting the following questions. Quote, "Please think back to January of 2017 and consider the following. Did you notice anyone who had unexplained injuries or a person's sudden departure from the area? Did you interact with anyone who seemed intensely interested in the case, or maybe someone who made significant efforts to avoid talking about it? Did you observe anyone who seemed to have an abrupt change in mood, lifestyle, or appearance around this time? Are you aware of someone who suddenly came into an unexplained source of money? If there is anything else that sticks out in your memory during that time period, please contact us." End quote. When reached by the media, members of Robert's family confirmed that they had not become aware of the search nor the recovery of any remains in advance, stating that they were learning in real time like everyone else. They issued a statement which reads, quote, "We would like to thank the Pennsylvania State Police, especially Trooper Greg Allen, Scranton FBI, New York State Police and their search dogs and teams, Lackawanna County personnel, and everyone else who has worked and is working to bring Bob home. We feel like something positive has to come from all this hard work. We have our fingers crossed." End quote. On Wednesday, March 30th, District Attorney Mark Powell issued a statement on the search and confirmed the recovery of human remains. He stated, quote, "While we are hopeful that they are the remains of Robert Barron Sr., we will have to await DNA testing to confirm the identity. I have spoken with the Barron family and remain hopeful that we can provide them with the closure they deserve. Additionally, people may be hesitant to share information due to close relationships with others who could have been involved. They may be concerned for their own safety or reputation, or they may have been unknowingly brought into a situation by the person or persons responsible. Relationships and loyalties can change, as do people and their perspectives. No matter the circumstances, it is not too late to come forward and help give Robert's family and friends the answers they deserve." End quote. District Attorney Powell stated that the human remains were recovered from the site of an old strip mine in the Connell's Patch section of Old Forge. However, law enforcement are optimistic even in advance of DNA analysis that this will be Robert and they will finally be able to move forward with their investigation. If you recall from previous coverage, while much evidence seemed to exist and pointed towards two potential suspects, earlier calls for the filing of charges were met with resistance from the DA's office as they wanted a body to be recovered before moving forward. Should these remains prove to be those of Robert Barron, then there's a chance we're going to see some charges coming sooner than later. While that remains speculative, it is what the family and members of law enforcement are hoping for. Still, they need more help from people who may have information about this case. Whether or not it seems important to you, you never know what information might help break this case open. On March 30th, the Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office posted a message on their Facebook page discussing the developments and, once again, asking for assistance. It reads in part, quote, "Yesterday, our investigators discovered human remains in the Connell's Patch section of Old Forge. While we are hopeful that they are the remains of Robert Barron Sr., we will have to await DNA testing to confirm the identity. The search will continue for as long as it takes to make sure we have left no stone unturned. I want to thank the FBI, Pennsylvania State Police, New York State Police, and their team of cadaver dogs, county detectives, the Old Forge Police Department, and the Pennsylvania Game Commission for their hard work and enthusiasm in our ongoing efforts to solve this case. I also want to thank members of the community for coming forward with tips that helped us move the investigation forward. Again, we are asking everyone, if you have any information that might be helpful, even if you think it is an insignificant piece, please come forward. We have a designated hotline at 570-963-6311 and a designated email address at lackawanna@lackawannacounty.org for you to share information which can be done anonymously." End quote. 6 years have passed since Robert Barron was last seen alive. Despite exhaustive efforts by his friends, family, and members of law enforcement, the case has grown stagnant. However, with the recovery of human remains announced, pending the determination of a DNA test, there's a good chance that Robert's case is growing a lot warmer. Law enforcement is convinced people in the local area possess knowledge that could bring this case to a close and help assuage the grief of a family which has suffered without answers for years. Someone out there knows more than they are saying, but it also seems apparent that someone is talking. Something led law enforcement back to that area to search, something drove them towards that strip mine. It's far better to tell what you know now, rather than having to explain why you kept your mouth shut later. It's a pretty easy choice. Keep silent to defend a killer or killers, or call in an anonymous tip, take the weight off your conscience, and help bring justice to a family and community that desperately needs it. Breaking news. Less than 24 hours after the release of this update, the Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office has announced that the remains found in the Connell's Patch area of Old Forge are in fact those of Robert Barron Sr. In addition to this identification, investigators have arrested Justin Schuback and charged him with Robert's murder. District Attorney Powell described the crime as a robbery gone wrong. I'm now going to play some of the press conference from earlier today so that you can hear this information firsthand.
Today we arrested Justin Schuback for the murder of Robert Barron Sr. that occurred back in 2017. Following an arraignment, the defendant will be placed in the Lackawanna County Prison and held without bail. The Barron family has waited a long time for justice to occur, and no one in law enforcement is going to say or do anything to jeopardize the successful prosecution of this case. We sincerely hope that today is a day that the Barron family can begin to start to move forward and find some relief and closure. I also want to commend the spectacular efforts of the investigative team that has been nothing short of inspiring. What I observed over the last few days was truly amazing. I want to give a special shout out to the FBI CAST unit, who provided a significant break recently in allowing us to break this case. The New York State Police and their cadaver dogs for actually finding Robert's remains 6 years after he was left in the woods. Certainly having a body helps, and that was a critical component, but it's also the location of the body that helps circumstantially establish that Mr. Schuback is the one and only responsible person for this murder. Mr. Schuback was friendly with Bobby Barron Jr., and there are facts laid out in the affidavit of probable cause to explain their relationship. But we will continue to investigate and determine if other arrests are warranted.
So there you have it. An arrest has been made of one Justin Schuback. Over the course of the next few weeks, there will be more developments in this case as we learn more about the probable cause which led to this arrest and the case that has been built against him. As always, I'll keep you updated to the best of my ability, and whenever this case evolves, there will be an update episode to discuss the legal maneuvering and how the trial is going to be. Update number 2, episode 37, The Disappearance of Danielle Stislicki. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Robert Barron, both the Times-Tribune and WNEP ABC News 16 provided the most in-depth coverage. The family runs a Facebook page entitled Finding Robert Barron, where you can also go to find additional information and details about this case. If you have any information about the disappearance of Robert Barron, please contact the Lackawanna County District Attorney's Office at 570-963-6717. You can also call Pennsylvania Crime Stoppers at 1-800-4PA-TIPS. Or you can visit pacrimestoppers.org, where you can submit information online and anonymously. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group.